As we enter June, it's Leadership and Management Month with GSD Talks. And we have Andy Scantland, who is an executive coach who I've worked with in the past. And he's just a really great thinker about how we can look at leadership and management while resolving our internal issues that kind of cause us to become sensitive or defensive and things that are generally counterproductive to actually leading.
So when I think about leadership, I think about giving people what they need in the moment to be able to get to the goal that you're seeking. Some people in this industry come up through the military or the government world versus others come up through other spaces. What I think about is kind of a continuum between being very directive in your leadership and being very participative in your leadership. And what I think is really helpful is when a leader can pull the right tool out in the moment to serve his or her person in giving that person what they need. That might be, if the building is on fire, it means giving very directive leadership. Hey, go out through this exit at this time. Other times where you're trying to build someone's confidence up, when you're trying to help them learn how to solve problems, now you show up more as a coach and you ask questions and you encourage them to think about options and alternatives for how they might show up.
Yeah, and he's going to touch on a few things. For instance, messaging. So how to message either up or sideways or down in leadership to your peers, but also your reports. And simple tactics, really, that just go along with how you're going to communicate change, obviously in the present day that we're living in, where it's all change, but also how to grow and be strategic around your career path, and whether that's management level and or if we're coming into the industry at an entry level.
Yeah.
If we think about what needs everybody has in the world, just as human beings, we can kind of boil them down to four things. One is, do I feel like I'm important and I have impact in the world? So importance. Two, do I have predictability and surety in the world? Do I know what's coming down the pipe, and do I have a plan for it? Do I have a sense of growth? Is my world expanding, or is it shrinking, or is it stagnant? Do I have a sense of growth in my world? And fourth, do I have connection to the group? Do I feel like I'm part of the group? Do I feel love for the group? Do I feel I have a role in the group? One of the ways you can manage up is to identify what need your leader is expressing in any given situation. If it's a situation in which things are tense, stressful, then what's the need that's likely to show up? It's going to be certainty. And what can you do as a human being, as a leader, to increase your boss's level of certainty? If the person feels like they're stagnating, how can you demonstrate that they have the area to grow? What can they take on as leaders? What can they take on for learning that will allow them to enhance their careers? Make sure that they feel a part of the group, that they're not separated or segregated from the group, that they feel like they have a role. Call out what role and value that they've really delivered for the group, and how they can support you in serving your team. And by identifying the need that's showing up in the moment, it's not to be manipulative. It's not to pull people in the direction they want to go. It's meeting their needs so you can have a really positive interaction and figure out how you can work together more cohesively. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of planning out your communication strategy to be the most effective communicator you can on any given day. And I think I heard you say something that I think will be foreign to a lot of people in security, but that we should be thankful and gracious with one another, and we should do that up. So you should let your manager know, like, hey, the other day, that was amazing. And it helped me in these ways. It helped me feel more secure about my role and my standing with you. Am I hearing that right?
I think you are, yeah. We want to reinforce the behavior that serves us, right? So if our boss shows up in a meeting and is really supportive or really gives some good guidance, we want to call that out. In that way, the person's going to be encouraged to do it again. On the other hand, we also need to be able to tell our truth to our leader. So that's probably done one-on-one rather than a group. But for the most part, I think people are really thankful for the guidance and the feedback that they get, as long as it's delivered in service to them, not in a way that serves just particularly our self-centered nature, but serves the group, serves the mission, and serves that human being across the table from us. I think nobody's immune from that.
Well, episode 2, we had Ron Worman from the Sage Group on. He's a really great help to the industry. He's not himself in security, but he's a business helper. And the crux of what we're going to talk about today is the value proposition of being security within an organization. How do we demonstrate that to the business, and how do we think about it not as security professionals, but as business professionals who happen to be in security?
One of the things, Tim, I think you know, and you got from that one time we served on a panel together, and you see when I'm doing the great conversation, is I treat the risk, resilience, and security professionals as business people, not as security people. In fact, I open up my conferences many times by saying, I've got good news for some of you and bad news for some of you. And the good news is, I think the good news is you're in the information management business. You're not in the security business. Security is a domain within that business, but you're in the information management business. And why do I say that? Well, let's go back to your opening, Tim. And by the way, I talk to business people like this too, so I'm treating you as one of my business clients, right?
Just don't send me a bill, please.
I remind people that the notion of strategic business value is the goal and the language of the CEO, right? Strategic business value. The value equation is the management of risk and opportunity, right? You can almost see that as an equation. Risk and opportunity equals value, right? So that's the CEO language. The language of the CEOs around strategic value. What most business people don't know is that the executive management team is the United Nations. There should be a Berlitz translator right in the middle of that table, because when I coach CEOs and their teams, I tell them each one of you speak a different language. CFO speaks a totally different language than the CEO. The CFO is the fiduciary of the organization. The CLO is the statutory risk of the organization. The HR person, if they're good, is the organizational strength expert of the organization, how to make that culture a leading innovative and leadership culture. And what is the language of the risk, resilience, security profession, right? So you have to define what your language is and how it intersects what the Berlitz translation is to each other member of the room. And by the way, you're not alone. You think the sales executive understands the language of the CFO and CLO or the COO? So we already have this problem in business. It's not unusual for people not to understand your language. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And those are really great points. I feel like, well, I don't feel like anything. I know for a fact that the security industry in general does not view itself as a business vertical within the organization. It views itself as a quite necessary cost center. And we provide value for times like these.
He brings that business knowledge and some of those business practices, lean principles, Six Sigma approach. And what I loved about this conversation is we dove kind of deep into how you could practically apply some of those to security and really reframe and repurpose your security organization, integrate it with the business, get a seat at the table with the other business leaders. And I think Ron had some great ideas on how someone could really take away from this conversation and go apply them immediately.
How do we, A, recognize opportunities, and B, feel like we're not stepping out of our lane? So in the military and the government, they say, stay in your lane. This is what you're here to do. It's very predefined. In the private sector, you have to be much more entrepreneurial, right? You have to find your opportunities. You have to expand your programs in ways that provide value to the company. So how can we get over that feeling of I'm stepping outside of my lane, I'm doing something wrong?
because you're business people, not security people. Remember, I told you that? At the end of the day, I think both of you said it best. You belong at the table. Now you got to show it. Can you intersect with their language? Can you interpret their language? Can you interpret what is germane as every one of those people at the table? Remember I said speaking all the different languages at the United Nations?
Mm-hmm.
Guess how they execute? And you're going to love this, John, being kind of a Six Sigma guy too. They have to deploy people to perform a role in a process using whatever tools we decide will help optimize that process and that role, right? So technology. So people perform roles in a process, a measurable process using technology. The problem is, in our industry, our risk resilient security industry, how often do we have truly measurable processes and roles? So if I was just explaining to another company in another industry, I said, one of your biggest challenges as I advised them on their business is you're doing nothing to establish a baseline at all for your customers. And without a baseline, they will never know your value, right? So what is the baseline that you can speak the language of the rest of the members of the executive team? What's that baseline that you can begin to show measurable value using risk as one of your levers?
Third episode of GSD Talks. Very, very excited as we continue on the professional development leadership conversations with the GSD team. So, Tim, why don't you go ahead and give us a little update on what did we talk about on this episode?
3 weeks in a row. I'm glad we've been able to keep it going, and we've actually been able to keep it interesting. We've talked about coaching for performance. We've talked about thinking of yourself as a business person in security rather than a security professional. And this is really complementary to both because we're talking about conversational intelligence, how to be present, how to think about having quality conversations, and ultimately how to gain or how to create trust, which is the foundation of all good working relationships.
And I just want us to think about something for a minute, which is how do we conduct most of our lives? We spend most of our life in conversation. And so the ability to have a conversation that leads to trust and leads to co-creation of solutions is something that we all need to get better at. And there is so much lost when you don't have a conversation or when you don't have a good conversation. So I know these are challenging times because we're in a pandemic and so much of the face-to-face has been taken from us currently. However, I think there's a reason why Zoom and platforms like that have done so well currently. And that's because people like now want to look at the person. They want to read their expression on their face. They want to create a connection. And you cannot do that through text or through email, because what happens is that there's implied tone and there's misunderstanding. And how many times have you had an email and you've stopped and thought, I think we're having an argument over email, and how did that happen, right? Because as I said, there's implied tone. And so I think the ability to have healthy conversations is really critical. And honestly, without getting political, even more important in these very challenging times.
I couldn't agree with you more. I think it's actually a competency for anybody in management or leadership to realize when an email or a message thread has become unproductive and to say, hey, I don't think I'm getting my, expressed interest across to you, or you're not hearing me the way I hope you're hearing me. So let's actually talk it out. So what advice do you give people on how to start having deliberate, healthy conversations?
First of all, there have been a number of articles recently, and both you and Lisa know this is a passion of mine, and that is that one of the skills we all need to acquire is the skill of listening to connect. Because many of us listen or think we listen, And what we're doing is we're listening to judge, like, oh, that wasn't such a smart thing Tim just said, or we're listening to reject, or we're listening to respond, right? And many of us, especially as we move up the ladder, feel that that's our job, to have an answer. And I would argue that in many instances, what our job is to listen and then have a question. And so listening to connect is probably one of the most generous things you can do for your employees, your partners, your family, your friends, because when we listen to connect, the other person opens up, and that's when a conversation really begins.
I think Tim really summed it up great. And, you know, from working with Angela Scalpello, who's just amazing and has so many great stories and information and advice, particularly for young professionals and those who are really trying to build credibility and trust within their teams and to be credible advisors to the C-suite and other senior leaders. So for me, a lot of the takeaways were just, you know, how do we build on different levels of conversation, which Angela talked about? How do we advance our position within the organization as a credible advisor? And really, how, if we don't have access to coaches or mentors right away, how can we still take steps into, you know, improving our conversational intelligence and our emotional intelligence to have more meaningful conversations?
Thing I want to just set the context is that many times we go up the ladder of conclusions, right? And so, for example, I'll give you an example from a client of mine. He was having issues with his boss, and we were working on how to have a better conversation with his boss. Basically, I said to him, so tell me about what you want to achieve and tell me what your concerns are. And he said, well, I want to talk to him about changing my role somewhat, but I know that he's going to want me to keep doing what I'm doing because I'm really good at it, and because he's going to be afraid that Brian is going to feel that I'm encroaching on his territory, so he's not going to go for it. And I said, wow. I said, this is really interesting. I said, how do you know this? I said, did you hear this from somebody? Did he tell you already? And he said, no. And I said, well, then how do you know this? So I share the data, I said to him. And in essence, without going into all the unpicking we did, he had gone up the ladder of conclusions based on other conversations he'd had. And so in essence, he went into that, he would have gone into that conversation primed for an outcome that he probably wouldn't have got, that he probably would have gotten. Instead, I said to him, why don't we rethink and reframe how you might have that conversation? So when I was coming up in the executive ranks, I had to overcome, I'm not saying that I'm Jennifer Lopez, okay, so let's be very clear about that. But because I grew up in a very working class neighborhood, right, first generation college, I always felt like I was Angela from the block. And did I really have the credibility, right, to be part of that executive C-suite? And so I think the first thing in presenting to the senior leadership team is to understand what's important to them, right? So I used to always say to people, CEOs want to know what other CEOs are doing, right? People in your executive team want to know what other businesses are doing, right? So making sure you know who they are as individuals and making sure you understand that you're going in there to solve a problem that will lead to the success of the business. Right? Going in there and not being territorial, going in there and thinking from a we perspective, right? I also sometimes go into a meeting and before the meeting, so in essence, in preparation for the meeting, ask people a couple of questions. At the end of this meeting, you will be able to finish this sentence how? This was a good use of my time and energy because we accomplished this, or we learned this, or we're able now to do this, right? So to understand that it's not about what you want to tell them, it's about what they need to hear to make the kinds of decisions that they need to make. and then to be brave enough to ask the question that one is always afraid to ask, which is, what do you think about what I just told you? How do you feel about what I just shared? Because you really want to know it in that moment when you can still have a conversation about it, right? So if they say, well, you know what, I think that's a risky strategy. Okay, can we double click on risk? What does risk mean to us as a senior leadership team? And can we talk about what our levels of risk tolerance are, right? So to make sure that it's about what they want to hear, not what you want to tell them, to, in essence, do some pre-work and understand what they're hoping that they'll be able to accomplish after you share what you've been asked to share. And then to also make sure that you've got the trusting relationships with people on the team who can give you honest feedback, who can say something to you like this, you know what, Tim, I know that you want to be seen as a strategic leader by the senior leadership here. I want you to know, though, that when you rush to solution, when someone asks you a question, it doesn't present you in that light, right? So someone being able to give you honest feedback because you trust them and they trust you to take it as a learning opportunity. And I think there's a lot of resources out there. I also think that it's really important that, I think I might have said this to you all, that we all get cabs. And I'm not suggesting that you get a medallion taxi. What I am suggesting is that you get a KAB, which is a kick-ass buddy. And that is somebody who will say to you, you know what, Tim, I thought you were making a commitment to get out there more and to network, right? Or, you know what, somebody who believes in you and reminds you, right? And holds your hope and your confidence those times when you've lost them for whatever reason. And I know one of the things I would say to Lisa from time to time is, you know what, you have options. Or I'd say to you, you know how to ask a question, right? Right? It's not about negotiating or pushing back or whatever it is that somebody might feel uncomfortable doing. It's about saying, you know what, what's your flexibility in terms of that salary? Or I'd like to talk about a higher number, right? It doesn't have to be confrontation, right? I think that's what sometimes stops people from having conversations, because we go up the ladder of conclusions and we already know the person's going to get angry and they're going to get defensive. And we don't know that. And it often doesn't happen.